with a start. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. Kyle was meeting Rachel in about 30 minutes. Kyle jumped out of bed and quickly got his things assembled. Quietly, he left his apartment and walked to City Hall. Rachel was standing on the corner a block away from the front. She motioned to Kyle.
"Hey, you," she whispered. "Are you ready to look around a bit? I have some ideas of where we can start."
Kyle nodded. Rachel started to move toward the back of City Hall. Kyle followed after her.
"I was watching the other detectives as they left today," whispered Rachel. "Several of them went back here."
Huh. Are they
The back of
goons?
City Hall was bland. Bushes crowded themselves against the walls. Few patches were bare. Rachel started spreading each bush apart, looking for anything important, but nothing appeared. Kyle looked around the wall. Something struck him as being odd, but he couldn't put his finger on it. "Rachel," he said, "I think this wall is made of jam." Kyle pushed his hand onto the jam wall. It was formed like wood and stone, but was incredibly sticky. And suddenly, the wall, formed like a hand, reached out to grab Rachel and Kyle and pulled them inward. The pair tumbled down a dark pipeline, spinning up and down and ramming into each other.
Ouch.
And suddenly, they landed in a well-lit... Kyle looked
Room.
up from the ground.
Sorry.
He and Rachel were surrounded by a circle of silent, hooded individuals. And in the center of the circle stood the Jam Man. "Hello, Kyle and Rachel," said the Jam Man. "I see that the time of our final encounter has come." The Jam Man began to pace in circles. "At first, I felt that I was dodging around your investigation easily. Time after time, I watched you from the shadows. I watched you grow as detectives. I watched you solve case after case.
There was 3 of them. That wasn't a lot for us to grow.
Soon, I realized your power had grown too far. I knew it would be
Jam
inevitable
layer.
that we would meet. I tried to get you, Kyle, to eat my jam and become my servant, but you found me out before the job was completed. Then, the moment you found the bear that I had used to bait in the bug vigilante, I knew that you could run around no longer. I lured you here to...
My
The
jam
Man
layer, so we can
grabbed the
finish
front of
things
his
once
face
and for all.
began to pull outwards. His skin began to stretch and tear, slowly bringing his features further and further from his head. And then, with a snap, the Jam Man's face fell off, revealing none other than Mayor Tom himself.
Knew it.
"Mayor Tom!
Gasped Rachel.
How could you?"
"Hold on, wait," said Mayor Tom. "I'm not in my final form yet." Mayor Tom grabbed the front of his face and began to pull outwards. His skin began to stretch and tear, slowly bringing his features further and further from his head.
Mayor layer.
Mayor Tom grabbed his face with his other hand and began to pull harder, stretching his face even further and tearing more. And then, with a massive crunch, Mayor Tom's face came off, revealing beneath a young boy.
Huh?
"Jerry the hot dog boy.
Gasped Rachel.
Has it always been you?"
"Yes," said the boy. "I have always been Mayor Tom.
Huh.
I had such a sweet deal being elected. I was able to enact a law saying that no crime would ever be my fault. It was wonderful. But then the cursed bug vigilante caught on to me, and soon to follow, so did you two." Jerry flicked his hand. "I must
Jerry
retain my
layer.
grasp on this city, as there is much to do. And so, it is time to fight." Jerry stuck his hand down his throat and removed 2 large, pointy hot dogs. He lunged at Kyle and Rachel, jabbing furiously.
Oh god, pointy hot dogs.
Rachel rolled to the side, pushing Kyle out of Jerry's way with her feet.
She drew a blunt weapon hidden beneath her shirt and began approaching Jerry, striking his hot dog weapons. Kyle got to his feet and looked around to get his bearings. The circle of people watched him closely, but didn't move. Slowly, Kyle realized that each person he looked at was under the intoxicating power of Jerry's jam. Kyle rushed toward the nearest individual. He forcefully inserted himself into their mouth and crawled into their stomach. Kyle began pushing and grabbing at the sides of the stomach, looking for traces of jam, and soon he found what he was looking for. Kyle opened his jaw wide and inhaled the jam he found, clearing the stomach entirely of the toxic substance. As soon as the jam was gone, Kyle crawled out of the mouth of the observer and entered another. One by one, Kyle cleaned each of Jerry's followers of jam, and after a period of time, they began to come to their senses. The followers began to look around them, confused. They looked at Jerry fighting with Rachel, and they became angry. The mob threw themselves at Jerry, biting at his ears and grabbing his legs. In retaliation, Jerry oozed hot dog minions out of his pores. They fought with the angry mob, trying to protect him.
Okay.
But it was no use. The mob was simply too angry, and soon it had become obvious that Jerry was going to lose the fight. Suddenly, with a burst of speed, Jerry jumped backwards and turned into a jam pile, flying above everyone's heads. He perched on top of a nearby wall and looked down on the people below. You might think that by getting rid of me, crime will cease, but I am not the only crime lord of this city. Rachel looked at the floor. Jerry took a moment to look at the people below him, but suddenly he disappeared. Over the next few days, Rachel and Kyle launched an investigation to find Jerry the hot dog boy. Man-hour after man-hour was put into the effort, but no lead in finding Jerry the hot dog boy was ever found. The detective force grew to be incredibly strong once they were not being controlled by the jam. Case after case was solved, and eventually Kyle and Rachel found that their help was no longer needed. The two resigned from their detective duties on the same day, walking out of City Hall together. The sun was soft in the sky. Yellow wisps of clouds flittered over the trees. The birds sang their evening calls. Rachel put her hand on Kyle's shoulder and stopped him next to a bench. They sat. Kyle and Rachel stayed on the bench together for several hours. They chatted about the cases, then about life, then about them. As evening came, Kyle got up to return to his apartment. Rachel caught his hand. "Kyle, I have something for you," she said. "I know your phone situation is not the best, so I got you something so we can keep in contact." She looked at him again.
She brought him the phone.
Rachel pressed a new phone into Kyle's hand. Kyle smiled gratefully. "And Kyle," she said, "are you going to go back to your interviews? Stay up late with Kyle coming back on air?" Kyle looked down at Rachel. She was looking right into his eyes. "If it is," she said, "let's do my interview. I would really appreciate that." Rachel suddenly jumped up from the bench and gave Kyle a quick peck on the cheek. Without saying anything more, Rachel walked away from the bench, a small bounce in her step. But for a moment, she looked back, and she smiled. As Rachel continued to disappear down the walkway, Kyle thought about what they had talked about that night. Somehow, they had let Jerry the hot dog boy slip through their grasp. But at the same time, somehow, it didn't matter. Kyle's final mystery had been solved.
Ah! Okay. There I'm so happy. Okay. So let's see. Endings. Okay, so there's all these ones left.
Kyle woke up. He is famous.
Okay. Browse social media, that's a new one.
Kyle decided to take some time to choose the perfect outfit, knowing how important appearance is. Kyle miraculously crammed his dumpy body into the suit. The chest pockets were filled with random knickknacks. Kyle wrote down his first question.
Are you a mother?
Kyle wrote down his second question.
What are some diet tips?
Kyle wrote down his third question.
What's your funniest story?
Kyle wrote down his last question.
Are you guilty?
Kyle ripped his page of notes out of the notebook and got up from the desk.
Back to desk. Back to room. Move to the kitchen. It feels so weird doing this. Everything is normal.
Kyle opened the fridge, intending to find... Kyle ate his breakfast slowly and thoughtfully, enjoying every bite. He felt refreshed.
I didn't miss that.
Kyle asked the store attendant whether or not they offered any free samples to important customers. The attendant gave Kyle a confused and slightly vacant look. Kyle began to beg for a free sample. Wanting Kyle to leave, the attendant grabbed a decrepit phone meant for spare parts and held it out.
Grab with hand.
Kyle took the phone placently from the outstretched hand and said quietly, "Thanks for your service." Kyle now has this phone to use forevermore.
Okay, let's skip to the end of the day.
Kyle, as Kyle approached her, "Good evening, Kyle," Kyle responded. And a moment after, "Good evening, everyone," said Kyle, looking at the camera. "Welcome back to Stay Up Late with Kyle. Tonight, I have the pleasure of interviewing the lovely Rachel May, who needs no more introduction." Kyle motioned to Rachel, who smiled and waved at the camera. "Hello, Kyle," she said. "I'm glad to be here." "Well, I'm sure we'll have a lot to discuss, so we might as well dive right in," said Kyle. "I'm very ready," said Rachel with a winning smile. Kyle produced the notes he had taken earlier. Rachel, "Are you guilty?" Kyle threw his questions on the floor, stood up, and pointed at her. Rachel's eye twitched slightly. "Guilty of what, dear Kyle?" She smiled disingenuously. "Guilty," spat Kyle, "of your crimes." Rachel did not answer. Her eyelids both started twitching uncontrollably. Kyle whipped out his phone and started dialing the police. Kyle quickly realized that the broken phone he had gotten for free was not able to call anyone. Kyle looked sadly at his hand, realizing he had botched a wonderful opportunity to be helpful. Rachel looked at Kyle smiling. Her eyebrows twitched a bit. "What's the problem, Kyle? Anything I can help you with?" She glared, still smiling. Kyle looked up from his hand sadly. He slowly shook his head. The interview continued on. Rachel answered questions cheerily. Kyle forced a smile through the entire episode, but he felt very sad inside. Kyle had missed his chance to be helpful.
Set to interview.
Kyle sitting. Kyle. Tonight,
Okay.
Kyle motioned to Rachel, who smiled and waved at the camera. Hello, Kyle.
Okay.
Kyle produced the notes.
Are you guilty?
Rachel.
Are you guilty?
Kyle threw his questions on the floor, stood up, and pointed at her. Rachel's eye twitched slightly. Guilty of what, dear Kyle? She smiled disingenuously.
Guilty,
Spat Kyle.
of your crimes.
Rachel did not answer. Her eyelids both started twitching uncontrollably.
Well, please, with the new phone.
Kyle pulled out his phone and dialed the police. Hello, police, said Kyle. I believe I have found a criminal. Rachel began to run towards the exit. On her way, she swatted Kyle's phone out of his hand. Kyle stuck out his leg. Rachel stumbled and crashed to the floor. But in a moment, she was on her feet. She drew a blunt weapon seemingly out of thin air and started to swing at Kyle. Before Kyle had a chance to react, a figure burst through the roof and blocked Rachel's attack. It was a middle-aged woman in a bug-shaped mask. She was brandishing a bug-shaped stick. The woman began to fight with Rachel, flicking her weapon back and forth with surprising speed. Rachel tried to fight back, but it was obvious she was no match for the interceptor. With one quick move, the bug vigilante drew her foot high above her head and drove it straight into Rachel's hand. The weapon clattered to the floor. Rachel attempted to run again, but was met with a stick to her legs. She fell at the feet of a police officer just arriving from Kyle's call. Rachel was charged with 7 cases of grand larceny. After her first month in jail, Rachel started a reality TV show about prison cooking, filmed from her cell. The show gained immense popularity, and somehow the public began to love Rachel all the more. Kyle made guest appearances on Rachel's show many times. The identity of the bug vigilante was never known. She remained a mysterious but important part of local law enforcement.
Huh. Okay, what happens if we let her go?
Good evening, Kyle. Kyle produced the... Rachel did
Oh,
not.
please, with no phone.
Rachel began to run
Let her
towards
go.
the exit. On her way, she swatted Kyle's phone out of his hand. Rachel disappeared out the door, never to be seen again. In the coming days, the grand larcenies that had been plaguing the city stopped. Kyle was credited with exposing Rachel's crime spree, but nobody remembered in a couple weeks. A month later, in the European city that Rachel had planned to vacation in, crime rates skyrocketed.
Huh. Okay, so Kyle got saved by bug vigilante. Okay, let's see. Start.
Kyle woke up.
Skip. Browse social media.
Kyle started to scroll through news articles on his phone. Stay Up Late with Kyle ranked #1 and #2 show on television. New East Bridge being constructed after being found to not actually exist. Authorities investigating. Another grand larceny and crime spree streak. Evidence points to perpetrator fleeing the country. Rachel May to unexpectedly leave the country on very, very long vacation after interview tonight. Who is the bug vigilante, recently spotted pursuing larcenists? Kyle fails to show up to several charity events. Bug vigilante shows up to charity events with fresh-baked pastries. Donations flourish. Hot dogs making resurgence as fuel source for both humans and tugboats.
Why tugboats?
Phone model recalled. Techno Gym stores blame overuse by customers. Kyle's phone exploded in his hands from overuse.
Oh. Cool. Okay. Open the closet, choose an outfit.
Kyle decided
get
to take some
slick suit.
Kyle
Exit the hallway, move the kitchen, open fridge, make breakfast, eat it, turn the kitchen. Actually, no, I can't really do any of this. I need to restart. It was interesting what social media was there. Okay, exit bed, open the closet, choose an outfit, get a suit on, sit at desk, write notes for interview.
Kyle wrote down his last question.
Are you guilty? Back to desk, back to room, exit a hallway, move the kitchen, open the fridge, make some breakfast, eat it, return to the kitchen, return the hallway, leave apartment, visit downstairs neighbor.
Approached his downstairs neighbor's door and knocked.
Consume Gabby.
Kyle unhinged his jaw and swallowed Gabby whole. Job done. Kyle returned to the middle of the street.
Yep. And then we skip to end of the day. And then we go back to when we call the police
Kyle
on
responded.
Rachel.
And I as well. After tonight, Kyle produced the notes he had taken earlier.
Are you guilty?
Rachel's eye. Guilty. Spat Kyle.
Call
Rachel
police
did not
with
answer.
new phone.
Kyle pulled out his phone and dialed the police. Hello, police,
I love
said
the
Kyle.
music.
I believe I have found a criminal. Rachel began to run towards the exit. On her way, she swatted Kyle's phone out of his hand. Kyle stuck out his leg. Rachel stumbled and crashed to the floor. But in a moment, she was on her feet. She drew a blunt weapon seemingly out of thin air and started to swing at Kyle. Kyle, having nothing to defend himself with, was smacked repeatedly in the head. Kyle lost consciousness several times, but somehow managed to remain upright. Rachel, thinking Kyle had not been incapacitated, continued her assault. Eventually, standing upright or not, it became apparent that Kyle had been adequately incapacitated. Rachel glanced around, slightly guiltily, and shuffled out the door. In the following days, Rachel disappeared from the country. Crime rates plummeted. Kyle was credited with cracking the case on a crime spree. Nevertheless, Rachel was never caught.
Okay. Wither away.
Kyle decided to stay put and wither away. Kyle withered successfully and died.
Shucks.
Kyle is now a ghost. This does not relieve him of his responsibilities. Kyle walked
Go through as a
Kyle,
ghost.
you-
Go inside. Get the claymore.
expecting a
Okay, leave apartment. Consume Gabby again.
Kyle unhinged his jaw. Job done. Kyle returned to the middle of
Turn to apartment. Turn to bedroom. Choose an outfit.
Kyle Moran.
Back. Sit at desk. Write notes.
Kyle
Are you a mother?
Kyle
Diet tips.
Kyle wrote down
Funny story.
Kyle wrote down his last question.
Are you guilty?
Kyle ripped his page of notes out of the notebook and got up from the desk.
Okay. Now, we skip to the end of the day.
Kyle hurried to the set. Per normal, he ceased to be a ghost before he arrived. Sitting across from his host chair was a glamorous woman with an air of genuinity. As Kyle approached her, Rachel looked up and smiled. "Good evening, Kyle," she said, looking him in the eyes. "I've been looking forward to being here." Kyle responded. "And I as well, Rachel," answered Kyle, extending his hand in greeting. "You are a most welcome guest." After other mild exchanges of pleasantries, Kyle and Rachel were prompted to take their places for the broadcast. A moment after seating, the studio lights brightened and the cameras clicked on. "Good evening, everyone," said Kyle, looking at the camera. "Welcome back to Stay Up Late with Kyle. Tonight, I have the pleasure of interviewing the lovely Rachel May, who needs no more introduction." Kyle motioned to Rachel, who smiled and waved at the camera. "Hello, Kyle," she said. "I'm glad to be here." In response, Kyle collapsed on the floor. From a combination of stressful preparation and not eating anything, Kyle had passed out. Nobody in the studio quite knew.
Okay, first thing we do is we wither away.
Kyle decided to stay put and wither away.
Okay,
Kyle,
get out of bed, exit the hallway, check to lock the door, float through,
Kyle.
go inside, get laser claymore,
Expect-
back to room, back to hallway, leave apartment, visit downstairs
Kyle,
neighbor,
a middle.
consume Gabby,
Kyle unhinged. Job done. Kyle returned to the middle of the street.
return to apartment, return to bedroom, scavenge,
Kyle quickly crouched.
bugs,
Kyle started to. Soon,
eat,
Kyle threw.
back to bedroom. Open closet, choose an outfit,
Kyle decided.
select suit,
Kyle.
back, sit at desk, write notes for interview,
Kyle wrote
digest,
down his third
funniest
question.
story.
Kyle
Are you
wrote down
guilty?
his last question. Kyle ripped his page of notes out of the notebook and got up from the desk.
Back to desk. Back to room. Okay, hopefully I did that in the right order. Yeah.
Kyle hurried to the set. Per
I hope I
normal,
don't mess
he
this
ceased
up.
to be a ghost before he arrived. Sitting across from his host chair was a glamorous woman with an air of genuinity. As Kyle approached her, Rachel looked up and smiled. "Good evening, Kyle," she said, looking him in the eyes. "I've been looking forward to being here." Kyle responded. "And I as well, Rachel," answered Kyle, extending his hand in greeting. "You are a most welcome guest." After other mild exchanges of pleasantries, Kyle and Rachel were prompted to take their places for the broadcast. A moment after seating, the studio lights brightened and the cameras clicked on. "Good evening, everyone," said Kyle, looking at the camera. "Welcome back to Stay Up Late with Kyle." Kyle vomited all of the horrible things he had eaten earlier onto the floor. Rachel looked at Kyle, concerned, gave a couple coughs, and decided to play it cool and keep the show running. Kyle stopped, then vomited again, then continued with a shaky voice. "Tonight, I have the pleasure of interviewing the lovely Rachel May, who needs no more introduction." Kyle motioned to Rachel, who smiled and waved at the camera. "Hello, Kyle," she said. "I'm glad to be here." "Well, I'm sure we'll have a lot to discuss. So we might as well dive right in," said Kyle. "I'm very ready," said Rachel with a winning smile. Kyle produced the notes he had taken earlier.
Are you guilty?
Rachel. "Are you guilty?" Kyle threw his questions on the floor, stood up, and pointed at her. Rachel's eye twitched slightly. "Guilty of what, dear Kyle?" She smiled disingenuously. "Guilty," spat Kyle, "of your crimes." Rachel did not answer. Her eyelids both started twitching uncontrollably. Kyle pulled out his phone and dialed the police. "Hello, police," said Kyle. "I believe I have found a criminal." Rachel began to run towards the exit. On her way, she swatted Kyle's phone out of his hand.
Chirper.
Kyle stuck out his leg. Rachel stumbled and crashed to the floor. But in a moment, she was on her feet. She drew a blunt weapon seemingly out of thin air and started to swing at Kyle. Kyle produced his laser claymore and blocked her first offenses. A grand fight between the two started. Blow was traded for blow, spins, flips. Rachel threw a large swing towards Kyle's head. He blocked forcefully, sending himself forwards. Kyle and Rachel found themselves inches away from each other, face to face, weapons crossed. As they looked at each other, something magical happened. Kyle thought about their time as detectives together. Kyle thought about her sharp deductions. He thought about her witty, polite answers to his questions. Rachel began to think about how well Kyle had prepared just to talk to her. She thought about how he cared for other people. She thought about his focus on bringing joy to others. Kyle and Rachel had slowly, insidiously been falling in love. Kyle and Rachel's lock broke. They continued to fight back and forth, but their eyes never parted. Rachel spun around, leg out. She kicked Kyle's claymore out of his hand. She grabbed Kyle by the front of the shirt and tugged him close. "Perhaps," she whispered to him, "the last thing I should steal is your heart."
Oh, I'm dying.
Rachel pecked Kyle on the lips and slid out the door,
Oh
disappearing.
my god.
In the following days, Rachel was not found. Many sums of money and artifacts that had been stolen from museums and banks were returned overnight. Small amounts of the sums were missing. Equal amounts were donated anonymously to homeless charities. Kyle spit Gabby back out after his fight with Rachel. She continued to be a vigilante and stopped many crimes. After receiving a note one night under his door, Kyle took a sudden vacation to a city in Europe. Although he had stated to his fans that it would be a short trip, he never returned. Slowly, Kyle fell out of the common mind. News outlets began to cover other topics. Reruns stopped airing. Kyle faded into obscurity. But it's rumored that a couple from the U.S. has started a family on the coast of the British Isles. And they seem quite happy to not be famous anymore.
I'm so happy. That was so sweet. I loved it. And that's all endings. Which this won't make any sense come December. God, that was so good. We can become frogs. Hey, frog. It's just a giant frog.
He is famous.
Okay, well, that is technically the end of Kyle is Famous. Kyle is Detective. Kyle is famous. Rachel is guilty. That's technically at least the end for now. I might come back later and do some extra stories. I might do some custom stories. I might do some custom stories coming later on in the life. Words. My brain is fried. It's currently 2 in the morning. But no. Okay, for now, technically, that is the end of Kyle is Famous. If you guys like the series, hit that like button, see more of my content. Hit the subscribe button, let me notified whenever I upload. Hit the notification bell. I'm happy that they got together in the end. In the description will be links to my Patreon, Twitch, Twitter, merch stores, all that fun jazz. The game store page and the game devs link as well. I'll see you guys in the next video. Which is probably going to be a Minecraft map. Okay. I'm very happy with how that ended. I'm happy they got together. I guess.